She braced herself as the boots crunched closer, dust rising around the gate. The Americans had arrived, rumored to be cruel, unclean, merciless. She clutched the folds of her tattered uniform, jaw clenched. But then one of them removed his hat, a wide, sun-stained cowboy hat, and bowed. Not mockingly, not sarcastically, bowed. The camp was somewhere in Texas, she would later learn, though she only saw plains stretching into sunlight and men with spurs on their boots. What stunned her wasn't the rifles or fences. It was the way one of them, a tall young man with leathered skin and a calm drawl, handed her a glass bottle of Coca-Cola, cold, sweating. He looked straight at her, and in that moment she felt something that splintered her fear. He didn't see a prisoner. He didn't flinch or leer or command. He just said, "You looked thirsty, ma'am." It wasn't kindness. It was dignity, and it changed everything. The truck hissed to a halt, kicking up a plume of red dust that settled over the women's uniforms like ash. The sun was brutal, the kind of heat that pressed against the skin like punishment. She stepped down carefully, her legs stiff from hours of silent travel. All around her, other women followed, clutching their meager belongings, canvas satchels, rolled blankets, a few lucky keepsakes tucked under arms. They were in Texas now. They had heard the name before, spoken in the growl of American GIs, scribbled in censored letters, feared in whispered rumors, but none of them could have imagined it like this. The sky stretched wider than anything back home. The land was flat and open, fenced with barbed wire, but there were no snarling dogs, no barking orders. Just a few men in brown uniforms standing near the gate, their posture relaxed, rifles slung low, and, to her confusion, hats tipped back in the sun like farmers resting between chores. One man stood out immediately. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, revealing sun-darkened arms. A silver belt buckle caught the light, and perched on his head was the strangest thing of all, a cowboy hat. Not the hard caps of soldiers, but something straight from cinema reels they had seen before the war, when American movies still flickered in Tokyo's theaters. She tensed, waiting for the order to line up, to march, to submit. Instead, the cowboy walked up slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, and offered her something cold. She blinked at the glass bottle in his hand. It was sweating in the heat, beads of moisture sliding down the label she couldn't read. He smiled, not in triumph, but like someone greeting a neighbor, and said it again. "You looked thirsty, ma'am." His accent curled around the word like smoke. She didn't know whether to slap it from his hand or cry. Her fingers moved on their own, curling around the bottle's smooth surface. The chill of it shocked her skin. Her training screamed that it must be a trick, some performance to soften them before cruelty. But his eyes didn't mock her. He didn't see a defeated enemy. He didn't even seem to see a soldier. He saw a woman, tired, scorched, thirsty, and he called her ma'am. It was a small word, but in that word was a fracture, a crack in everything she'd been told, that Americans were animals, that capture was a death worse than death, that no mercy would ever come. And yet here she stood, surrounded not by brutality, but by something infinitely stranger. Civility. One of the other women whispered something sharp in Japanese, a warning not to trust. Another kept her head low and refused to touch the offered water. But she stood still, unmoving, the bottle cold against her palm. She lifted it, slowly, and tasted it, sweet, bubbly. The fizz hit her tongue like fire, and she nearly coughed. The cowboy chuckled softly, tipping his hat. The others stared, some glared. A few looked away, but she held the bottle to her chest, unable to let go. It wasn't the soda that stunned her. It was the gaze, the absence of contempt. She had looked into the faces of captured Chinese civilians during the war. She remembered how her own officers had treated them with indifference, if they were lucky, with fists, if not. She had seen soldiers in her own army slap nurses, steal rations, leave the wounded behind to die in jungle mud. Mercy was not part of her vocabulary, not from enemies, not even from allies. And now here, in the American desert, a man with dust on his boots and a wide-brimmed hat had treated her like a neighbor, like a guest. The other guards mirrored his quiet manner, some nodding politely, others stepping aside to let the women pass. No shouting, no prodding with rifles. Just a strange, eerie stillness, as if they didn't see prisoners at all. Later that night, as the sun fell behind the horizon in a blaze of orange, she sat on her bunk, the empty bottle beside her like a relic. Outside, the cowboy's boots clicked against the wood. He was walking the perimeter. Not watching for escape, she realized, but simply making his rounds. She lay down slowly, staring at the ceiling above her, too stunned to sleep. Her mind couldn't stop circling back to one question. How could an enemy offer her respect? How could the war end not in screams, but in a stranger calling her ma'am? Something in her had shifted. It was small, quiet, but irreversible. She wasn't sure yet what it meant. Only that tomorrow, when breakfast came, she would be looking not just for food, but for that same look in the cowboy's eyes. The one that didn't see her as a prisoner, the one that saw her as something else entirely. But before that bottle, before Texas, before the silence of civility, there had been a vow. Spoken with trembling lips and clenched fists, it was drilled into her like marrow. Better to die than be captured. She had whispered those words with her fellow nurses beneath a cherry blossom tree in spring, standing at attention while an officer paced in front of them. He wore an eye patch, a limp in one leg, and a voice like flint striking steel. They were girls then, barely into womanhood, pressed into military service not as warriors, but as extensions of war, secretaries, field medics, clerks. But the oath was the same. Bushido was not optional. In the training compound outside Tokyo, the code echoed through morning drills. They practiced administering morphine with shaking hands, wrapping bandages around rubber limbs, and reciting, almost rhythmically, what would happen if they were captured. Torture, defilement, disgrace. No rescue would come. No honor would remain. Their duty was to serve, to endure, and if need be, to die silently. The instructors didn't smile, they didn't comfort. Even during meals they barked slogans over rice and soup. A woman of Japan surrenders only to death. She had believed it, deeply, fully. Her mother had sent her off with tears and pride, whispering, "Bring honor to your ancestors." Her brother, already at the front, had simply bowed, stiff and formal. No one spoke of fear, only duty. And so when she boarded the ship to the Philippines, her hands didn't shake. Not visibly, but inside she carried the code like armor, heavy and rigid, made of shame and silence. She worked in a jungle hospital for nearly 2 years. Not a hospital, really. A series of canvas tents strung together with rope and desperation. The wounded came in pieces, shrapnel still inside them, limbs blackened, eyes wide with agony. There was no electricity, no comfort. She worked 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, sleeping curled on a mat, the smell of rotting flesh in her nostrils, rats rustling in the corners. They were told they were winning, even as the jungle swallowed them, even when the supplies stopped arriving, even when the wounded stopped screaming because they no longer had the strength. Her fingers learned to operate in darkness. Her face learned to stay still as men died with her name on their lips. There were no tears, only duty. The rumors came slowly, whole islands falling, American tanks landing. Then came the whisper that broke them. The Americans were taking prisoners, women, and not killing them, not defiling them, just keeping them. It was said with horror, not hope. Some nurses swallowed cyanide, others wandered into the jungle and were never found. To be captured meant your name would be struck from family records. Your spirit would wander, unhonored, unremembered. So, when her outpost fell, and the Americans surrounded the remnants of their unit, she had expected her breath to stop. She had waited for bullets, for screams, for darkness. Instead, there was shouting, in English, and the strange command to drop it. She had no weapon to drop, just a medical bag, already half empty. Her arms rose on instinct, and the shame pooled in her stomach like sickness. That was the moment the dread began. Not fear of death, but of surviving. What would her mother say? What would her ancestors think? Her commanding officer had burned the flag and shot himself. One nurse tried, but the gun jammed. The rest were captured in silence, heads bowed like criminals. She could barely look at the Americans' faces, afraid they would sneer, or worse, pity. And now, in Texas, days after that shameful moment, she found herself haunted not by cruelty, but by kindness. The cowboy's eyes, the Coke bottle, the word ma'am, they stabbed deeper than any blade, because they made her question everything. The shame of capture had not gone. It clung to her skin, thicker than sweat. But something else had arrived alongside it. A crack, a breath of air through the walls she had built. She did not yet know what it was, but as she lay on the bunk, staring at the ceiling of a land that smelled of dust and tobacco, she knew one thing. Bushido had no answer for a cowboy who bowed. She awoke to birdsong. Not boots slamming against the floor, not shouted orders or barked commands, but the unfamiliar hush of Texas morning, wind moving through trees, a screen door creaking somewhere in the distance. For a moment she didn't move. The air smelled faintly of cotton sheets and something warm, almost sweet. Baking, maybe. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket, coarse but clean. She blinked against the sunlight slipping through the slats of the barracks window, casting golden stripes across the wooden floor. Her first thought wasn't comfort. It was suspicion. This was supposed to be the beginning of humiliation, the first step in a long ritual of shame, degradation, stripping them down to show them their defeat. That's what the officers had said. That's what she had believed. Instead, she had been handed a bar of soap. The night before, after they were assigned to their quarters, the guards had given them towels, clean uniforms, and directions to a shower house. She had entered the tiled room, braced for leers, for guards with sneers on their faces, but no one watched them. No one laughed. The room was filled only with steam and silence. The water had been hot, so hot it brought tears to her eyes. She had scrubbed until her skin ached, until the scent of jungle rot and fear washed down the drain. Some women wept openly under the spray. Others just stood still, stunned by something so simple. And now, waking in a clean bed, her body freshly clothed, her hair no longer crawling with lice, she found herself gripping the blanket as though it were a weapon. She didn't trust it. None of them did. The bunks were lined neatly, each one with a real mattress, a thin pillow, and a folded extra sheet. It was nothing like the bamboo mats and mud floors she had slept on for 2 years. The wooden walls were bare but solid. There was no filth, no rats, and perhaps strangest of all, no shouting. The guards outside walked quietly, rifles slung casually, their conversations soft and forgettable. The absence of violence was almost more unnerving than its presence. When the bell rang for breakfast, they lined up without speaking, unsure of what was to come. The mess hall smelled of coffee and something savory. Eggs, toast. She had not seen an egg in months. One of the women collapsed just before the door, knees buckling, face pale from a mixture of heat and disbelief. A guard stepped forward. She flinched, expecting him to yell, maybe grab her by the arm. Instead, the man knelt, another cowboy, his boots dusty, a red bandana tucked in his collar. He eased the woman up with both arms, cradling her as if she were a sister. Gently, wordlessly, he carried her to the shade and fanned her with his hat. Someone brought water. No orders were given. No punishment followed. The moment passed like a dream. Later that afternoon, she twisted her ankle stepping off the porch outside the barracks. A cowboy medic appeared, tall, quiet, smelling faintly of soap and something sharp, like menthol. He didn't ask questions. He knelt, examined her ankle, and began wrapping it in a clean bandage. His hands were rough, but careful. She couldn't stop watching them, watching him. He didn't speak Japanese. She didn't speak English. But when he looked up and gave a small, tired smile, her stomach twisted in confusion. The bandage was white against her skin, clean, real. And she remembered a soldier from her old unit who had broken his foot and been left behind without a second glance. That night, lying on her bunk, her foot propped up on a folded blanket, she stared at the ceiling and tried to summon anger, disgust, fear. But what she felt instead was the disorientation of kindness. It chipped at the edges of what she had believed. A soldier did not carry a fainted prisoner. A cowboy did not kneel before an enemy and bind her wound with care. The myth was cracking. Not with an explosion, but with every quiet act that didn't align with what she had been told. She had prepared for pain, for assault, for hatred. But what do you do when the enemy hands you a cup of coffee and calls you ma'am? When he ties your ankle with the tenderness of a brother? When your cell is softer than your childhood bed? She didn't know the answer. Only that each day here, in this strange country with its wide skies and two soft beds, she felt the walls of her certainty begin to tremble. And that was a different kind of terror altogether. It began with a smell, thick, rich, and impossible. She sat up in bed before her mind even caught up to the scent, something primal stirring before reason could weigh in. The barracks, usually still and muted in the early morning, had come alive with murmurs. Heads turned, nostrils flared, and then the first whisper, meat, not stew, not broth, not the faint memory of fish paste stretched over watery rice. No, this was meat that sizzled, real fat meeting fire. A woman near the door pressed her knuckles to her mouth and began to weep without a sound. She stood slowly, dizzy, as if the scent itself could knock her down. Outside, the air shimmered with heat already rising from the ground, but above it floated that impossible fragrance, seasoned, savory, edged with smoke. In the mess hall, trays were already being set, and at the far end, near the kitchen doors, she saw the cowboy, the same one who had handed her the Coke. He was seated at a long table, a plate in front of him, a fork in his hand. And on that plate, steak. They were called forward in small groups. She felt her feet move as if detached from her body. When the tray was handed to her, she could only stare. The meat lay heavy, glistening beside mashed potatoes and a roll soft as cotton. A thin pat of butter was melting down the top. There was even a slice of peach, sweet and syrupy. She barely noticed the cup of coffee. All she could see was the steak. Her fingers trembled as she carried the tray to the table. And then came the second shock. The guards sat down with them, Not behind glass, not in separate rooms. They sat at the same benches, ate the same food. The cowboy nodded at her as he chewed, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. No performance, no spectacle. Just a man eating lunch with people the world had taught her were supposed to be enemies. She picked up the fork. Her hand wouldn't stop shaking. The knife bit into the meat easily. She brought the piece to her lips. The flavor hit like a thunderclap, salt, fat, the deep warmth of cooked flesh. Her teeth sank in, her mouth flooded with juices, and her body reacted before she could stop it. Tears, hot and unrelenting, rose to her eyes. She tried to hide them, but beside her another woman was already covering her face. Another was crying openly, shoulders shaking. No one laughed. No one was scolded. The guards ate quietly, as if this were all perfectly ordinary. But it wasn't. Not to them. In the jungles of the Philippines, she had watched men boil leaves for broth. She had scraped fungus off trees and called it lunch. There were days when they fought over the stringy flesh of a rat, when powdered eggs were divided into crumbs and swallowed like gold. One officer had hoarded canned meat and traded it for obedience. She remembered chewing leather once to stop the pain in her stomach. That had been honor, they told her. That had been devotion. Now here, in the enemy's camp, she had more in one bite than she had tasted in years. And it burned, not just in her throat, but in her soul. She thought of the soldiers still starving in the jungle, the families scrounging for rice husks back home. She thought of her brother, lost in New Guinea, and wondered if he had died believing the same lie she once did, that Americans were beasts. She chewed slowly, ashamed of her joy. The meat was not just nourishment. It was a message. You are not invisible. You are not livestock. You are alive, and someone believes that means something. She hated how much it moved her, hated how it felt like betrayal just to swallow. After the meal, she sat with her tray in her lap, unable to move. The cowboy walked past, nodding once more. She didn't know his name, but in that moment he was the most confusing figure she had ever known. Not a liberator, not a captor, just a man who believed prisoners deserved steak. The others whispered that this must be a trick, a tactic. But she wasn't so sure anymore, because cruelty could be explained. But kindness like this, especially when it asked for nothing, unraveled something much deeper, something sacred, something terrifying. And the taste of meat lingered long after the plate was cleared. 2 days later, they were handed pencils, a thin sheet of paper, a chair near the shade. It wasn't an order, it was an invitation. A guard stood nearby, not watching, just present, as if to answer questions. She turned the paper over in her hands, once, twice. Her fingers touched the grain of it like it was something rare, sacred, because it was. She had not touched paper like this in over a year, and certainly not with the freedom to say her own words. "You may write home," the cowboy said. His accent curled the vowels gently. He smiled once, not too wide, not patronizing, just enough to say, "This is yours." Then he added, quieter, almost like a confession, "You have people waiting on your words." Her breath caught. It shouldn't have. But something about the way he said it, the certainty, the belief that her life still mattered, struck her in the place she had buried deepest. She sat slowly, pencil in hand, blank page before her. But nothing came. What could she possibly write? Her mother believed she was dead. That would have been the honorable assumption. Captured soldiers were often declared lost. It was more merciful than admitting disgrace. Her last letter home, over a year ago, had ended with vows of duty and undying patriotism. To write now would be to reveal the truth. She had failed. She had lived, and not only lived, but been treated with dignity. The pencil hovered. She imagined her mother's face, creased with worry, bent over a prayer in the family shrine. Could she truly say, "I am alive"? Could she say I was captured? What words could soften that blow? Around her, others scratched quietly at their pages. One woman wrote furiously, a mixture of tears and ink blotting her page. Another sat frozen, like her, unsure if this was some elaborate cruelty. Back home, they had been told Americans burned letters from prisoners, that they read every word, that even ink could betray the empire. But this paper bore no instructions, no demands, no threats. She began slowly. "Mother!" One word, and her throat clenched. "I am alive." She paused again. "I was taken prisoner in the Philippines." Each sentence felt like stepping off a cliff, yet there was no wind, no fall, just a deep stillness. She glanced at the cowboy again. He had moved on, offering paper to another woman. No one was watching her now, no one but the memories. "I am in America. They treat us kindly." That line alone felt impossible. If someone had written it to her a year ago, she would have called them a liar. She would have accused them of betrayal. But now, with the scent of cooked meals still clinging to her sleeves and the bandage on her ankle still clean, she couldn't deny what she'd lived. "I do not know what honor means anymore, but I know I am still your daughter." The pencil hesitated at the final line. She did not sign her name. Not yet, but she folded the paper with care, like it might break. Later, as they turned in their letters, the guards didn't read them. Not in front of them. No red stamps, no slashing censors, just hands accepting pages, promising to send them home. It felt like another impossibility. Walking back to the barracks, she was quiet. A different kind of quiet. Not stunned by fear, but by possibility. The idea that words might cross the ocean, that someone might read them, that her life, lived in disgrace, might still reach the mother who had given her the name she now dared to write again. She sat on her bunk and stared at her hands. They still trembled, but her chest felt lighter. Maybe, just maybe, survival did not erase her worth. Maybe silence was not the only way to live with shame. Maybe the cowboy was right. Maybe someone was waiting on her words. And maybe, for the first time since the war began, she believed they would hear her. That night, the sky turned the color of old coins. Gold slipping into copper, fading into blue so deep it swallowed sound. The air was warm, but not stifling. The wind carried the scent of mesquite and something faintly floral. Desert flowers, maybe. She lay on her bunk with her arms folded behind her head, eyes half closed, listening to the distant murmur of boots on gravel, the occasional screen door creaking shut. It was the sound of routine, of peace, of nothing happening. And then came the music, soft at first, like breath through a crack in the world. A single note, bent with aching care, floated through the open window. Then another, the slow, haunting rise of a melody that didn't belong to this land, and yet somehow only belonged here. It was a harmonica. She knew the sound from American films, but she had never heard it played like this. Low, soulful, raw. The notes danced slowly, meandering through the fading light like something sacred. She sat up, heart stuttering. Across the camp, near the guard tower, one of the cowboys sat on the steps, legs stretched out, hat tilted low, the harmonica cupped gently in both hands. He wasn't playing for anyone, not really, not a performance, just a man with music, alone with his thoughts. She leaned against the window frame, letting the sound wash over her. The melody tugged at something old inside her, older than duty, older than shame. It wasn't a tune she recognized, but it didn't matter. It was tender, and that alone made her chest ache. Music was not part of war, not for them. They had sung marching songs, yes, chanted patriotism in unison. But beauty, softness, was indulgence. Weakness. Their instructors had said it plainly. Emotions softened the heart, and a soft heart would break. The Bushido path demanded silence, discipline, stoicism. But here, in a prison across the sea, under a sky thick with stars, a cowboy played a lullaby with no lyrics. And she, weakened by hunger and memory, startled by kindness, began to cry. Not the sharp hidden sobs of pain or humiliation, but something slower, warmer. A tear slid down her cheek, then another. She didn't wipe them away. No one could see her in the dark, and even if they did, what would it matter? Because in that moment she wasn't a prisoner, not really. She wasn't a soldier, not a failure. She was just a woman, listening to music she didn't understand and feeling safe enough to cry. That, more than anything, stunned her. Safety. It was a word she hadn't tasted in years. Not since the sirens first howled over Tokyo. Not since the jungle heat began to steal the names of her friends. Not since her fingers grew calloused from stitching wounds that never healed. Even in surrender, she had expected fear. But now, here, her body told her a different story. The harmonica wove its way through the barracks, slipping under the door, curling around the bunks like a spell. She could hear other women shifting, some sitting up, some stilled. No one spoke. The music wouldn't allow it. It said more than words could. As the last note faded into the warm dusk, she closed her eyes. Her cheeks were wet. Her hands were still. For the first time in what felt like centuries, she didn't brace herself for morning, didn't fear what kindness might cost her, because for once, kindness asked for nothing. It only gave. Like a tune drifting through the dark, played by a cowboy who never looked up, who never asked her name, who only played because something inside him said the night needed music. And that, she realized, was the most powerful thing war had never taught her. Beauty could survive anything, even this. She was sitting by the barracks wall, peeling a peach with the small camp-issued knife, when the cowboy approached. Dust on his boots, straw tucked behind one ear. He had a paper envelope in one hand. No clipboard, no orders, just that same slow drawl and a shrug when he stopped beside her. "Grow something, if you'd like," he said, handing her the envelope. "Dirt's decent over there near the fence." Then he tipped his hat and walked away. She stared at the paper for a long time. It felt absurd. Seeds. A packet of seeds. Like they were friends in a village, like this was a school project, like she hadn't watched death rot the world 1 inch at a time. She turned the packet over. Green beans. She didn't even know what they looked like fully grown. Still, later that afternoon, when the sun had dipped low and the heat lost its edge, she walked toward the patch of dirt he'd mentioned. It was just outside the laundry building, framed by a crooked fence and a few scattered stones. Not large, just enough space to kneel and disappear from sight. She crouched slowly, knees popping, and stared at the ground. She had never planted anything in her life. That wasn't what girls like her were taught. Her mother's hands had been busy with cloth, with prayer tablets, with polishing lacquered furniture. Her father had never touched soil. Growing things had been for farmers, peasants, not daughters of imperial bloodlines, not women trained to mend gunshot wounds and recite the words of surrender through clenched teeth. But here she was, fingers trembling, holding tiny green beans like they were pieces of glass. The first plunge into the soil startled her. It was soft, willing, warmed by sun. Her hands moved slowly, clumsily. A small trench, a line of seeds, a gentle covering. She didn't know if she did it right. She didn't care. For the first time in years, her hands were doing something that didn't involve blood. The symbolism was not lost on her. Planting meant something had a future. It required patience, hope, and the outrageous assumption that tomorrow existed. She came back the next day, then the next. She found herself smoothing the soil gently, watching for signs of life. It wasn't about beans. It was about permission. The unspoken allowance to care about something again, to choose. Even this small act of choice, of planting, was rebellion. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was doing. Others noticed. A few women joined her, helping to carry water in tin cups. They didn't speak much, but they smiled. One even began humming while they worked. The guards didn't interfere. One cowboy walked by and said, "Damn fine lines you're diggin'," and tipped his hat. She smiled without realizing it. A week later, the first sprout broke the surface. She stared at it for a long time. A tiny green spear pushing up from earth that had once been trampled by boots and sorrow. It was small, insignificant by every military standard, but to her it was thunder. What if my life matters? The question grew alongside the plant. It haunted her gently, like birdsong at dawn. It wasn't a declaration. It was a whisper, an idea she dared not say aloud. But the plant said it for her, because something was growing where there had once been nothing. And she had made it happen. No orders, no rules, no survival manuals, just choice. She had touched death so many times, it had shaped her bones. But here, under Texas sky, behind American barbed wire, life was returning, in sprouts, in harmonicas, in letters home, in food shared without condition, and now in the soft resistance of soil. She knelt a while longer, then stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. Tomorrow she would come back, not because she had to, but because something here was worth coming back to. And that changed everything. The classroom was just a mess tent with folding chairs and a chalkboard, but to her it might as well have been another planet. The heat still rolled in under the canvas flaps, and flies still wandered in lazy loops, but no one paid them much mind. The women sat in rows, posture stiff at first, each holding the same thin booklet. On the cover, Basic English, Lesson 1. She turned it over slowly, heart caught somewhere between confusion and suspicion. The cowboy, his name was Tom, though she still couldn't bring herself to call him that, stood at the front, chalk in one hand, a softness in his eyes that had nothing to do with pity. "No one's grading you," he said, that familiar drawl rounding out every syllable. "You're here because you can be." And then, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, he began to write. A is for apple, B is for book, C is for... She stared at the letters as if they were bones of some ancient language, and in a way they were. This was the language of the enemy, the language of the bombs, of the leaflets dropped in the jungle, of the men who shouted orders across ruined villages, and yet here it was, small and fragile on a chalkboard, approachable, even gentle. Her lips moved slowly, forming the alien shapes. The tree. A girl beside her giggled and then blushed, embarrassed, but the sound made her smile. Not mockery, just surprise. The room was filled with it, surprise that they could learn, that someone wanted them to. It was a quiet revolution. Education was not something prisoners received. Back home, it was a privilege tightly held, meted out with duty. Here, though, behind barbed wire, a guard handed her a pencil and said, "Try." And that single word weighed more than she expected. It meant you're worth the effort. She flipped to the back of the book. Blank pages. Meant for practice, Tom had said, and so she practiced. At first, just words from the lessons, then fragments of thought, then something bolder, her name, in English letters, awkward, uneven strokes at first. But she wrote it again, and again, until it started to look real, until it felt like hers. It was a moment no one saw, no applause, no permission, just a single woman in a camp half a world away from the only life she'd ever known, writing her name in the language of her captors, and not flinching. The lesson ended as the sun dipped low, casting the classroom in amber light. Tom handed her a piece of chalk as she walked past. "You've got good lines," he said. She blinked, not understanding. "Your handwriting," he clarified, then tipped his hat and moved on. She held the chalk the way one might hold a relic, her fingers white with dust, and then she said it, out loud, just once, under her breath. The word from today's final page, free. It stopped her cold. She wasn't free. Not really, not by any nation's definition, but for one breathless second, saying that word made something open inside her, something long locked. It wasn't escape, it wasn't forgiveness, it was just a sliver of light. Freedom, she realized, might not be a place, it might be a thought, or even a word, said at the right time. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We read every one. She walked back to her bunk, her name still tucked into the pages of her workbook. And though the gates remained locked, something inside her had stepped out, and it didn't plan on going back in. The clang of the bucket echoed louder than she expected. It had slipped from her grip, wet hands, a moment of distraction, and struck the ground near the water station with a sharp metallic crack. Instinct jolted through her like electricity. She spun to look. The guard closest to her, a young man with sunburned arms and a jaw dusted with freckles, had turned at the sound. But he didn't flinch. Not in fear, not the way she'd seen villagers recoil when boots approached, not like the raw flinching of prey. He blinked once, startled by the noise, and then moved toward her, not with tension, but with concern. "You all right?" he asked. His voice was calm, even kind, and in that moment she was undone. Because he hadn't braced himself, he hadn't reached for a weapon, he hadn't barked a warning or narrowed his eyes. He had seen her, a woman in tattered uniform, scarred and silent, and responded not with suspicion, but with respect. That kind of reaction was foreign. She felt it physically, like a rug had been yanked out from under years of belief. Back home, when she'd dropped something in front of an officer, she'd been punished. Once, in the jungle, she had miscounted medical rations. A superior had struck her across the cheek before she could finish apologizing. There was no softness in the chain of command. Mistakes were shame, shame was weakness, and weakness invited retribution. But here, a dropped bucket earned a gentle question. He didn't flinch because he didn't see her as a threat. More than that, he saw her as human. She crouched to pick up the bucket, her hands trembling slightly, and he crouched with her. "No rush," he said. "Water'll still be here." She nodded, unsure if she could speak. That night, back in the barracks, she stared at her hands in the dim light. They were calloused and strong, the hands of someone who had worked, endured, survived. And yet she had spent years being told they were only useful if they obeyed, if they hurt, if they bled for orders. What if they were allowed to fumble? What if dropping a bucket didn't mean disgrace? She thought about dignity, how the word had always been tied to obedience, to suffering well, to dying without complaint. But maybe here dignity meant something else. Maybe it lived in small mercies, in how someone looked at you when you failed, in the grace you were offered not because you deserved it, but because they believed you were still worth it. She remembered another guard, older, slower, who always nodded when passing them. Just a nod, a fraction of respect. At first she thought it was habit. Later she understood. It was choice. And choice, she now knew, was where dignity began. The women around her were changing, too. Some had started brushing their hair again. Others sewed small repairs into their sleeves, not out of vanity, but to say, I'm still here, I'm still me, and I'm worth holding together. In the silence after lights, out, she whispered to the ceiling. He didn't flinch. And the words felt heavier than they should have, like a stone tossed into deep water. Ripples spreading across everything she thought she knew. The enemy had respected her, more than her own officers ever had. And maybe, just maybe, that meant the war hadn't broken her. Maybe it had revealed who she was underneath the fear. Maybe the war was no longer the only story she would carry. Maybe, from now on, she would carry this one too. The ocean didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a question, a long, slow drift between what was and what remained. She stood at the rail of the American ship as Japan's coastline emerged, blurred mountains, broken docks, clusters of skeletal buildings. Her hands gripped the railing tight, the Texas blanket folded over one arm, the harmonica tucked into her satchel. Inside her pocket, folded so many times it felt like silk, was the letter she had written weeks earlier, addressed to no one, meant for everyone. The shoreline was quieter than she imagined, not silent, just muffled, like grief had blanketed the entire country. Cities that once roared with industry now sagged like beaten lungs. Villages, once tidy with order, were scattered like bones. Her mother's house still stood, barely. The gate hung crooked, the garden was dust. When she stepped inside, her mother gasped as if seeing a ghost, then said nothing, not for minutes, not for hours. The silence wasn't anger, it was shock. It was the sound of a woman recalibrating reality because her daughter had come home, alive, clean, not broken. When words did come, they were careful, fragile. But when she told her mother everything, about the food, the music, the seeds, the man who handed her a harmonica just because it might help her sleep, her mother bowed her head and wept, not from disgrace, but from relief. That night, lying on the tatami floor, she stared at the low ceiling and listened to a Japan she no longer fully belonged to. The rhythms, the rituals, the weight of survival without hope. She had expected to slide back into her old self, but that woman, the one who left in uniform, who saluted without question, was gone. What came back was someone else, someone who knew what dignity felt like, even in chains. And now that knowledge was heavy. She had been treated better by the enemy than by her own command. She had been called ma'am by a cowboy, while officers had barely used her name. She had tasted kindness in captivity and silence in freedom. That contrast did something to her soul. It didn't fill her with hatred, it filled her with fire. She pulled out the harmonica and played a note, soft, then another. It wasn't the same as Texas. The breeze here carried dust and memory instead of mesquite and sunset. But the sound still mattered. Her mother paused at the door, listening, and for a second something between them healed. She decided to keep the letter. Not to mail it, just to own it, to carry a truth that no one could erase. because her memory was now an act of rebellion, not against her country, but against the story they had been told. She would remember the cowboy who bent to help her plant a seed, the medic who bandaged her without flinching, the teacher who said, "Try." She would remember that meat wasn't just food, it was mercy. That language could be an open door. That survival was not shame. It was testament. And if she ever had children, she would tell them the truth, not just about the war, but about what came after, about the music that crossed borders, about the moment a man heard a bucket fall and didn't reach for a gun, about how, sometimes, the people you're told to hate hand you a pencil and say, "Write your name." She would tell them about Texas, and she would not whisper. If this story moved you, tap like and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts, because stories like this deserve to be carried, just like a letter, folded tight, held close, and never forgotten.